Hi guys, welcome to part 10 of book 1, The Law of One with the Raw Material. I'm not going to give too much commentary before we get started with this section. I'll just reiterate that Ra will be speaking about how we graduate from first density to second density to third density and how long each period is and what it means to be in first, second, third, and fourth density. And basically it's like first density are the elements, so rock and fire and wind and light and all that stuff. And then second density ends up being something that's more living, that has plants and trees and animals. And then third density would be us, but he gets more into the cycles, how long each cycle can last, and also the cycles within cycles of second and third density, which gets really interesting. And then in the later part, they actually do start talking a lot about Esther Island and the statues that are there and how they came to be and what they were for, but I won't give you any spoiler alerts before we get started. I will give lots of commentary at the end of this segment, so let's get on with it. And here is part 10 of The Law of One with the Raw Material.
Session 19, February 8, 1981. Ra, I am Ra. I greet you in the love and the light of the infinite creator. We communicate now. Questioner, we are concerned in this communication with the evolution of mind, body, and spirit. It seems to me that a good place to start would be the transition from the second to the third density, then to investigate in detail the evolution of third density entities of Earth, paying particular attention to the mechanisms which help or hinder that evolution. Do all entities make a transition from second to third density, or are there some entities who have never gone through this transition? Ra, I am Ra. Your question presumes the space-time continuum understandings of the intelligent energy which animates your illusion. Within the context of this illusion, we may say that there are some that do not transfer from one particular density to another, for the continuum is finite. In the understanding which we have of the universe or creation as one infinite being, its heart beating is alive in its own intelligent energy. It merely is one beat of the heart of this intelligence from creation to creation. In this context, each and every entity of consciousness has its will experiencing each and every density. Questioner, let's take the point at which an individualized entity of second density is ready for transition to third. Is this second density being what we would call animal? Ra, I am Ra. There are 3 types of second density entities which become, shall we say, inspirited. The first is the animal. This is the most predominant. The second is the vegetable, most especially that which you call sound vibration complex, tree. These entities are capable of giving and receiving enough love to become individualized. The third is mineral. Occasionally a certain location, place, as you may call it, becomes energized to individuality through the love it receives and gives in relationship to a third density entity which is in relationship to it. This is the least common transition. Questioner, when this transition from second to third density takes place, how does the entity, whether it be animal, vegetable, tree, or mineral, become inspirited? Ra, I am Ra. Entities do not become inspirited. They become aware of the intelligent energy within each portion, cell, or atom, as you may call it, of its beingness. This awareness is that which is awareness of that already given. From the infinite come all densities. The self-awareness comes from within, given the catalyst of certain experiences, understanding, as we may call this particular energy, the upward spiraling of the cell or atom or consciousness. You may then see that there is an inevitable pull toward the, what you may call, eventual realization of self. Questioner, then after the transition into the third density, am I correct in assuming, we'll take Earth as an example, the entities would then look like us? They would be in human form? Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct, taking your planetary sphere as an example. Questioner, when the first second density entities became third density on this planet, was this with the help of the transfer of beings from Mars, or were there second density beings who transferred into third density with no outside influence? Ra, I am Ra. There were some second density entities which made the graduation into third density with no outside stimulus but only the efficient use of experience. Others of your planetary second density joined the third density cycle due to harvesting efforts by the same sort of sending of vibratory aid as those of the Confederation send you now. This communication was, however, telepathic rather than telepathic vocal or telepathic written due to the nature of second density beings. Questioner, who sent the aid to the second density beings? Ra, I am Ra. We call ourselves the Confederation of Planets in the service of the Infinite Creator. This is a simplification in order to ease the difficulty of understanding among your people. We hesitate to use the term, sound vibration, understanding, but it is closest to our meaning. Questioner, then did this second density to third density transition take place 75,000 years ago? Approximately? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner, where did the second density beings get physical vehicles of third density type to incarnate into? Ra, I am Ra. There were among those upon this second density plane those forms which when exposed to third density vibrations became the third density, as you would call the sound vibration, human entities. That is, there was loss of body hair, as you would call it, the clothing of the body to protect it, the changing of the structure of the neck, jaw, and forehead in order to allow the easier vocalization, and the larger cranial development characteristic of third density needs. This was a normal transfiguration. Questioner, over how long a period of time was this transfiguration? It must have been very short. Ra, I am Ra. The assumption is correct, in our terms at least, within a generation and one half, as you know these things. Those who had been harvested of this planet were able to use the newly created physical complex of chemical elements suitable for third density lessons. Questioner, can you tell me how this newly created physical complex was suited to third density lessons and what those lessons were? Ra, I am Ra. There is one necessity for third density. That necessity is self-awareness, or self-consciousness. In order to be capable of such, this chemical complex of body must be capable of abstract thought. Thus, the fundamental necessity is the combination of rational and intuitive thinking. This was transitory in the second density forms operating largely upon intuition which proved through practice to yield results. The third density mind was capable of processing information in such a way as to think abstractly and in what could be termed useless ways, in the sense of survival. This is the primary requisite. There are other important ingredients, the necessity for a weaker physical vehicle to encourage the use of the mind, the development of the already present awareness of the social complex. These also being necessary, the further development of physical dexterity in the sense of the hand, as you call this portion of your body complex. Questioner, this seems to be a carefully planned or engineered stage of development. Can you tell me anything of the origin of this plan or its development? Ra, I am Ra. We go back to previous information. Consider and remember the discussion of the logos. With the primal distortion of free will, each galaxy developed its own logos. This logos has complete free will in determining the paths of intelligent energy which promote the lessons of each of the densities given the conditions of the planetary spheres and the sun bodies. Questioner, I will make a statement then of my understanding and ask you if I am correct. There is what I would call, physical catalyst operating at all times upon the entities in third density. I assume this operates approximately the same way in second density. It is a catalyst which acts through what we call pain and emotion. Is the primary reason for the weakening of the physical body and the elimination of body hair, etc., so that this catalyst would act more strongly upon the mind and therefore create the evolutionary process? Ra, I am Ra. This is not entirely correct, although closely associated with the distortions of our understanding. Consider, if you will, the tree for instance. It is self-sufficient. Consider, if you will, the third density entity. It is self-sufficient only through difficulty and deprivation. It is difficult to learn alone for there is a built-in handicap, at once the great virtue and the great handicap of third density. That is the rational intuitive mind. Thus, the weakening of the physical vehicle, as you call it, was designed to distort entities towards a predisposition to deal with each other. Thus, the lessons which approach a knowing of love can be begun. This catalyst then is shared between peoples as an important part of each self's development as well as the experiences of the self in solitude and the synthesis of all experience through meditation. The quickest way to learn is to deal with other selves. This is a much greater catalyst than dealing with the self. Dealing with the self without other selves is akin to living without what you would call mirrors. Thus, the self cannot see the fruits of its beingness. Thus, each may aid each by reflection. This is also a primary reason for the weakening of the physical vehicle, as you call the physical complex. Questioner: then we have second density beings who have primarily motivation towards self and possibly a little motivation towards service to others with respect to their immediate family, going into third density and carrying this bias with them, but being in a position now where this bias will slowly be modified to one which is aimed toward a social complex and ultimately towards union with the all. Am I correct? Ra: I am Ra. You are correct. Questioner: then the newest third density beings who have just made the transition from second are still strongly biased towards self-service. There must be many other mechanisms to create an awareness of the possibility of service to others. I am wondering, first, about the mechanism, and I am wondering when the split takes place where the entity is able to continue on the road to service to self that will eventually take him on to fourth density. I'm assuming that an entity can start, say, in second density with service to self and continue right on through and just stay on what we would call the path of service to self and never be pulled over. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is incorrect. The second density concept of serving self includes the serving of those associated with tribe or pack. This is not seen in second density as separation of self and other self. All is seen as self, since in some forms of second density entities, if the tribe or pack becomes weakened, so does the entity within the tribe or pack. The newer initial third density has this innocent, shall we say, bias or distortion towards viewing those in the family, the society, as you would call, perhaps, country, as self. Thus, though a distortion not helpful for progress in third density, it is without polarity. The break becomes apparent when the entity perceives other selves as other selves and consciously determines to manipulate other selves for the benefit of the self. This is the beginning of the road of which you speak. Questioner: then, through free will, sometime within the third density experience, the path splits and the entity consciously chooses, or he probably doesn't consciously choose. Does the entity consciously choose this path of the initial splitting point? Ra: I am Ra. We speak in generalities, which is dangerous for always inaccurate. However, we realize you look for the overview, so we will eliminate anomalies and speak of majorities. The majority of third density beings is far along the chosen path before realization of that path is conscious. Questioner: can you tell me what bias creates the momentum towards the chosen path of service to self? Ra: I am Ra. We can speak only in metaphor. Some love the light. Some love the darkness. It is a matter of the unique and infinitely various creator choosing and playing among its experiences as a child upon a picnic. Some enjoy the picnic and find the sun beautiful, the food delicious, the games refreshing, and glow with the joy of creation. Some find the night delicious. Their picnic being pain, difficulty, sufferings of others, and the examination of the perversities of nature. These enjoy a different picnic. All these experiences are available. It is the free will of each entity which chooses the form of play, the form of pleasure. Questioner: I assume that an entity on either path can decide to change paths at any time and possibly retrace steps, the path changing being more difficult the farther along the path the change is made. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is incorrect. The further an entity has, what you would call, polarized, the more easily this entity may change polarity, for the more power and awareness the entity will have. Those truly helpless are those who have not consciously chosen but who repeat patterns without knowledge of the repetition or the meaning of the pattern. Questioner: I believe we have a very important point here. It then seems that there is an extreme potential in this polarization, the same as there is in electricity. We have a positive and negative pole. The more you build the charge on either of these, the more the potential difference and the greater the ability to do work, as we call it in the physical. This would seem to me to be the same analogy that we have in consciousness. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is precisely correct. Questioner: then it would seem that there is a relationship between what we perceive as a physical phenomenon, say the electrical phenomenon, and the phenomenon of consciousness, in that they, having stemmed from the one creator, are practically identical but have different actions. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. Again, we oversimplify to answer your query. The physical complex alone is created of many energy or electromagnetic fields interacting due to intelligent energy. The mental configurations or distortions of each complex further adding fields of electromagnetic energy and distorting the physical complex patterns of energy. The spiritual aspect serving as a further complexity of fields which is of itself perfect but which can be realized in many distorted and unintegrated ways by the mind and body complexes of energy fields. Thus, instead of one, shall we say, magnet with one polarity. You have in the body-mind-spirit complex one basic polarity expressed in what you would call violet ray energy, the sum of the energy fields, but which is affected by thought of all kinds generated by the mind complex, by distortions of the body complex, and by the numerous relationships between the microcosm, which is the entity, and the macrocosm in many forms, which you may represent by viewing the stars, as you call them, each with a contributing energy ray which enters the electromagnetic web of the entity due to its individual distortions. Questioner: is this then the root of what we call astrology? Ra: I am Ra. This will be the last full question of this session. The root of astrology, as you speak it, is one way of perceiving the primal distortions which may be predicted along probability possibility lines given, shall we say, cosmic orientations and configurations at the time of the entrance into the physical mental complex of the spirit, and at the time of the physical mental spiritual complex into the illusion. This then has the possibility of suggesting basic areas of distortion. There is no more than this. The part astrology plays is likened unto that of one root among many. Questioner: is there anything that we can do to make the instrument more comfortable? Ra: I am Ra. This instrument is well aligned. You are being very conscientious. We request you take more care in being assured that this instrument is wearing footwear of what you would call vibratory sound complex shoes. I am Ra. I leave you in the loving the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai. Session 20. February 9, 1981. Ra: I am Ra. I greet you in the loving the light of the infinite Creator. I communicate now. Questioner: to go back a bit, what happened to the second density entities who were unharvestable when the third density began? I assume that there were some that did not make it into third density. Ra: I am Ra. The second density is able to repeat during third density a portion of its cycle. Questioner: then the second density entities who did not get harvested at the beginning of this 75,000-year period, some are still on this planet. Were any of these second density entities harvested into the third density within the past 75,000 years? Ra: I am Ra. This has been increasingly true. Questioner: so more and more second density entities are making it into third density. Can you give me an example of a second density entity coming into the third density in the recent past? Ra: I am Ra. Perhaps the most common occurrence of second density graduation during third density cycle is the so-called pet. For the animal which is exposed to the individualizing influences of the bond between animal and third density entity. This individuation causes a sharp rise in the potential of the second density entity, so that upon the cessation of physical complex the mind-body complex does not return into the undifferentiated consciousness of that species, if you will. Questioner: then can you give me an example of an entity in third density that was just previously a second density entity? What type of entity do they become here? Ra: I am Ra. As a second density entity returns as third density for the beginning of this process of learning, the entity is equipped with the lowest, if you will so call these vibrational distortions, forms of third density consciousness, that is, equipped with self-consciousness. Questioner: this would be a human in our form then who would be beginning the understandings of third density. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: speaking of the rapid change that occurred in the physical vehicle from second to third density, this occurred, you said, in approximately a generation and a half. Body hair was lost and there were structural changes. I am aware of the physics of Dewey B. Larson, who states that all is motion or vibration. Am I correct in assuming that the basic vibration that makes up the physical world changes, thus creating a different set of parameters, shall I say, in this short period of time between density changes, allowing for the new type of being? Am I correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: is the physics of Dewey Larson correct? Ra: I am Ra. The physics of sound vibrational complex, Dewey, is a correct system as far as it is able to go. There are those things which are not included in this system. However, those coming after this particular entity, using the basic concepts of vibration and the study of vibrational distortions, will begin to understand that which you know as gravity and those things you consider as n dimensions. These things are necessary to be included in a more universal, shall we say, physical theory. Questioner: did this entity, Dewey, then bring this material through for use primarily in the fourth density? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: Yesterday we were talking about the split that occurs when an entity either consciously or unconsciously chooses the path that leads to either service to others or service to self. The philosophical question of why such a split even exists came up. It was my impression that just as it is in electricity, if we have no polarity in electricity we have no electricity, we have no action. Therefore, I am assuming that it is the same in consciousness. If we have no polarity in consciousness we also have no action or experience. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. You may use the general term work. Questioner, then the concept of service to self and service to others is mandatory if we wish to have work, whether it be work in consciousness or work of a mechanical nature in the Newtonian concept in the physical. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct with one addendum. The coil, as you may understand this term, is wound, is potential, is ready. The thing that is missing without polarizing is the charge. Questioner, then the charge is provided by individualized consciousness. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. The charge is provided by the individualized entity using the inpourings and instreamings of energy by the choices of free will. Questioner, thank you. As soon as the third density started 75,000 years ago and we have incarnate third density entities, what was the average human lifespan at that time? Ra, I am Ra. At the beginning of this particular portion of your space-time continuum the average lifespan was approximately 900 of your years. Questioner, did the average lifespan grow longer or shorter as we progressed into third density experience? Ra, I am Ra. There is a particular use for the span of life in this density and, given the harmonious development of the learning teachings of this density, the lifespan of the physical complex would remain the same throughout the cycle. However, your particular planetary sphere developed vibrations by the second major cycle which shortened the lifespan dramatically. Questioner, assuming a major cycle is 25,000 years, at the end of the first major cycle, what was the lifespan? Ra, I am Ra. The lifespan at the end of the first cycle which you call major was approximately 700 of your years. Questioner, then in 25,000 years we lost 200 years of lifespan. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner, can you tell me the reason for this shortening of lifespan? Ra, I am Ra. The causes of this shortening are always an ineuphonious or inharmonious relational vibration between other selves. In the first cycle this was not severe due to the dispersion of peoples, but there was the growing feeling complex distortion towards separateness from other selves. Questioner, I am assuming that at the start of one of these cycles there could have been either a positive polarization that would generally occur over the 25,000 years or a negative polarization. Is the reason for the negative polarization and the shortening of the lifespan the influx of entities from Mars who had already polarized somewhat negatively? Ra, I am Ra. This is incorrect. There was not a strong negative polarization due to this influx. The lessening of the lifespan was due primarily to the Law of One, Book I, Session 20. 194. Lack of the building of positive orientation. When there is no progress those conditions which grant progress are gradually lost. This is one of the difficulties of remaining unpolarized. The chances, shall we say, of progress become steadily less. Questioner, the way I understand it, at the beginning of this 75,000-year cycle, then, we had a mixture of entities, those who had graduated from second density on Earth to become third density and then a group of entities transferred from the planet Mars to continue third density here. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. You must remember that those transferred to this sphere were in the middle of their third density so that this third density was an adaptation rather than a beginning. Questioner, what percentage of the entities who were here in third density at that time were Martian and what percentage were harvested from Earth's second density? Ra, I am Ra. There were perhaps 1/2 of the third density population being entities from the red planet, Mars, as you call it. Perhaps 1/4 from second density of your planetary sphere. Approximately 1/4 from other sources, other planetary spheres whose entities chose this planetary sphere for third density work. Questioner, when they incarnated here did all three of these types mix together in societies or groups or were they separated by groups and society? Ra, I am Ra. They remained largely unmixed. Questioner, then did this unmixing lend to a possibility of warlike energy between groups? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner, did this help to reduce the lifespan? Ra, I am Ra. This did reduce the lifespan, as you call it. Questioner, Can you tell me why 900 years is the optimum lifespan? Ra, I am Ra. The mind-body-spirit complex of third density has perhaps 100 times as intensive a program of catalytic action from which to distill distortions and learn teachings than any other of the densities. Thus the learned teachings are most confusing to the mind-body-spirit complex, which is, shall we say, inundated by the ocean of experience. During the first, shall we say, perhaps 150 to 200 of your years as you measure time, a mind-body-spirit complex is going through the process of a spiritual childhood. The mind and the body are not enough in a disciplined configuration to lend clarity to the spiritual influxes. Thus, the remaining time span is given to optimize the understandings which result from experience itself. Questioner: then at present it would seem that our current lifespan is much too short for those who are new to third density lessons. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Those entities which have, in some way, taught themselves the appropriate distortions for rapid growth can now work within the confines of the shorter lifespan. However, the greater preponderance of your entities find themselves in what may be considered a perpetual childhood. Questioner: back in the first 25,000-year period, or major cycle, what type of aid was given by the Confederation to the entities who were in this 25,000-year period so that they would have the opportunity to grow? Ra, I am Ra. The Confederation members which dwell in inner plane existence within the planetary complex of vibratory densities worked with these entities. There was also the aid of one of the Confederation which worked with those of Mars in making the transition. For the most part, the participation was limited, as it was appropriate to allow the full travel of the workings of the confusion mechanism to operate in order for the planetary entities to develop that which they wished in, shall we say, freedom within their own thinking. It is often the case that a third density planetary cycle will take place in such a way that there need be no outside, shall we say, or other self-aid in the form of information. Rather, the entities themselves are able to work themselves towards the appropriate polarizations and goals of third density learned teachings. Questioner: I make the assumption that if maximum efficiency had been achieved in this 25,000-year period, the entities would have polarized either toward service to self or toward service to others, one or the other. This would have made them harvestable at the end of that 25,000-year period, in which case they would have had to move to another planet because this one would have been third density for 50,000 more years. Is this correct? Ra, I am Ra. Let us untangle your assumption, which is complex and correct in part. The original desire is that entities seek and become one. If entities can do this in a moment, they may go forward in a moment, and, thus, were this to occur in a major cycle, indeed, the third density planet would be vacated at the end of that cycle. It is, however, more towards the median or mean, shall we say, of third density developments throughout the one infinite universe that there be a small harvest after the first cycle, the remainder having significantly polarized. The second cycle having a much larger harvest, the remainder being even more significantly polarized, the third cycle culminating the process and the harvest being completed. Questioner: was the Confederation watching to see and expecting to see a harvest at the end of the 25,000-year period in which a percentage would be harvestable fourth density positive and a percentage harvestable fourth density negative? Ra, I am Ra. That is correct. You may see our role in the first major cycle as that of the gardener who, knowing the season, is content to wait for the spring. When the springtime does not occur, the seeds do not sprout, then it is that the gardener must work in the garden. Questioner: am I to understand, then, that there was neither a harvest of positive or negative entities at the end of that 25,000 years? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Those whom you call the Orion group made one attempt to offer information to those of third density during that cycle. However, the information did not fall upon the ears of any who were concerned to follow this path to polarity. Questioner: what technique did the Orion group use to give this information? Ra, I am Ra. The technique used was of two kinds. 1. The thought transfer, or what you may call telepathy. 2. The arrangement of certain stones in order to suggest strong influences of power. This being those of statues and of rock formations in your Pacific areas, as you now call them, and to an extent in your Central American regions, as you now understand them. Questioner: were you speaking in part of the stoneheads of Easter Island? Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: how would such stoneheads influence the people to take the path of service to self? Ra, I am Ra. Picture, if you will, the entities living in such a way that their mind-body-spirit complexes are at what seems to be the mercy of forces which they cannot control. Given a charged entity such as a statue or a rock formation charged with nothing but power, it is possible for the free will of those viewing this particular structure or formation to ascribe to this power over those things which cannot be controlled. This, then, has the potential for the further distortion to power over others. Questioner: how were these stone heads constructed? Ra: I am Ra. These were constructed by thought after a scanning of the deep mind, the trunk of mind tree, looking at the images most likely to cause the experience of awe in the viewer. Questioner: did the Orion entities do this themselves? Did they do this in the physical? Did they land, or did they do it from mental planes? Ra: I am Ra. Nearly all of these structures and formations were constructed at a distance by thought. A very few were created in later times in imitation of original constructs by entities upon your Earth plane density. Questioner: what density Orion entity did the construction of these heads? Ra: I am Ra. The fourth density, the density of love or understanding, was the density of the particular entity which offered this possibility to those of your first major cycle. Questioner: you use the same nomenclature for the fourth density negative as for the fourth density positive. Both are called the dimension of love or of understanding. Is this correct? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Love and understanding, whether it be of self or of self toward other self, is one. Questioner: what was the approximate date in years past of the construction of these heads? Ra: I am Ra. This approximately was 60,000 of your years in the past time-space of your continuum. Questioner: what structures were built in South America? Ra: I am Ra. In this location were fashioned some characteristic statues, some formations of what you call rock and some formations involving rock and earth. Questioner: were the lines at Nazca included in this? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: since these can only be seen from an altitude, of what benefit were they? Ra: I am Ra. The formations were of benefit because charged with energy of power. Questioner: I'm a little confused. These lines at Nazca are hardly understandable for an entity walking on the surface. He cannot see anything but disruption of the surface. However, if you go up to a high altitude you can see the patterns. How was it of benefit to the entities walking on the surface? Ra: I am Ra. At the remove of the amount of time-space which is now your present, it is difficult to perceive that at the time-space 60,000 years ago the Earth was formed in such a way as to be visibly arranged in powerful structural designs. From the vantage point of distant hills. Questioner: in other words, at that time there were hills overlooking these lines? Ra: I am Ra. This will be the last full question of this session. The entire smoothness, as you see this area now, was built up in many places in hills. The time-space continuum has proceeded with wind and weather, as you would say, to erode to a great extent both the somewhat formidable structures of Earth designed at that time and the nature of the surrounding countryside. Questioner: I think I understand then that these lines are just the faint traces of what used to be there? Ra: I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: thank you. We need to know whether or not it is possible to continue with another session today and whether there is anything that we can do to make the instrument more comfortable. Ra: I am Ra. It is possible. We ask that you observe carefully the alignment of the instrument. Otherwise, you are conscientious. Is there any short query before we close? Questioner: I intend in the next session to focus upon the development of the positively oriented entities in the first 25,000 years. I know you can't make suggestions. Can you give me any comment on this at all? Ra: I am Ra. The choices are yours according to your discernment. I leave you in the love and the light of the one infinite creator. Adonai.
Okay, we're going to stop it there. This starts to get so interesting to me. So the first cycles for first density obviously last a very, very long time, millions and millions of years. And it's not until we get into second density that we can start actually breaking it down to, sizable chunks. So, the second density also lasted not quite as long as the first, but it did last a long time because there was living creatures on Earth at that time. Now, what causes an entity to go from second density to third density is consciousness, being aware of a self. So even though like a flower or, even a tree or, all the, animals, most of the animals on the planet are in second density. They can't graduate to third until not only are they aware of themselves, but aware of themselves as an individual and not part of a tribe or a pact, because it's you have to be within your own self and aware of yourself as an entity, and that will bring you into 3D. And then once you're in 3D, well, then that's when other entities, either even from here or can go into 3D, or other entities from other planets even can join into 3D. And what Ra was trying to say is that the humans, the way we are now, we went through a very quick change from, when Neanderthals kind of dropped away, and then, when the first humans that were almost looked just like us, except we were hairier, and the shape of our heads were a little different, and our vocal cords weren't quite, developed, things like that. But we went through when we entered 3D, we went through a very quick shift into the structure of our bodies. Ross said it was only 1.5 generations. That's how fast the humans developed into 3D. To be able to incarnate one as oneself, as conscious within their own self, and for the first time move out of the tribe kind of mentality for survival. We were able to survive, one person was able to survive on their own. They were conscious of their self to survive. So that's what he was kind of trying to get to. And I'm glad that the questioners went ahead and asked questions about who was it that was being incarnated in the first group of 3D. And some of those entities were here from first and second D. So that means that we have entities here that were a rock, a flower, a tree, an animal in the Sahara, or so they did the long process of incarnating here through first, second, and third density, which is a very long time, you can imagine. Now, this also happens on other planets, and Ra does talk about how Mars and Venus, there were third densities on those planets that couldn't finish their progress through third density because their planet was dying, and catastrophic things happen on other planets, so they have to find so if you were to die incarnated on a different planet, when you reincarnate, you can go to another planet that's in the same time process that you were in. So we do have 3D entities here from Mars and Venus. After their planet had died, they have to still finish their 3D cycle, so they have to go to another 3D planet. Now, some entities can go to other planets in different parts of our solar system and things like that are inhabited in 3D, and you can reincarnate there for however long you want. The choice is yours, or you can finish being reincarnated here. So we're a mixed bag of the entities that are here on Earth right now, finishing out the 3D. And another thing that Ra talked about, and I found this interesting, is that the very first creatures or entities that went through the first of 3 25-year periods, their lifespan was really long, because to learn how to incarnate as a first 3D being, they said that they were 900 years old. The first humans that were living here was an average lifespan, which seems incredible to me. And then they went down to, in the second incarnation, they went down to 700. And as we go, every time we reincarnate here in 3D, our life cycles were actually getting really short, because we were able to learn so much within one lifetime and advance so much within our one lifetime. Our lifetimes would eventually get shorter and shorter within 3D. Now, as we go to 4 and 5 and 60, of course, that's going to change again. But For the last cycle of a 3D, our lives end up getting very short right now. And another thing that Ra talked about in this last segment was, was there any entities that were polarized, from 3D to 4D, negative or positive, during the second cycle? And there wasn't. But the Orion group, which is a negatively polarized group, did attempt to harvest negatively polarized entities that were here on Esther Island. And so Esther Island was like a victim to their own environment because obviously resources were getting depleted. There was a lot of war on the islands, and so the Orion group came here and they built the statues that we see that are still there. And they actually built those statues pretty much the same way that the pyramids were built, through thought, through putting consciousness in the firsty form of rock, and that's how those statues were created. And they did this in an attempt to gain power over the people, to get them negatively polarized to service to self. But it actually didn't work. The civilization collapsed, and they weren't able to get a harvest of negative. So the Orion group failed during that time. So it's something that was interesting, and I hadn't thought about it before, that however, because the pyramids were built is the same way those statues were built, through the same method, through thought. And I just thought that part was really interesting. And this was just like a tiny segment. I don't think they talk about Esther Island and those statues again in any of the recordings. So we just got a little bit of it. But yeah, it does get very interesting. And like, I guess those 60,000 years ago is when the Orion group had come and tried to do a harvest in the creation of those statues. So that was during the second cycle. So right now, we are part of the end of the third cycle. So 75,000 years have gone by, and we're just entering 4D now. So we're in a bit of a mixed bag here of the entities. So we are going to start getting, those entities that are in 4D that can easily come here, and they don't have to come here in 3D anymore. They can finish their 4D cycles now on this planet, now that we're a 4D planet, which I guess is really exciting. You hear a lot about it. Indigo children, we have a lot of the wanderers, we have a lot of entities, which kind of makes sense, because it seems like our population exploded because a lot of entities want to come here, not just to witness the transition from 3D to 4D, but also to begin their 4D cycle or finish their 4D cycle here on Earth as we had just transitioned. And that didn't really come across very well, I don't think, in some of these particular recordings, but from other material that I've read, I got that. So that was a really good segment. I will see you guys in part 11. Stay tuned for the next video.